All right, hello, fifth graders. Welcome to our second day of reading in our virtual learning setting here. Today, I'm coming to you from my own setting, which is in my home. So the background looks a little bit different, but we still have the same supplies, and we are going to be jumping right into our reading. Today, you're going to need your pink Unit 4 workbook, as well as something to write with. And then at the end of this lesson, you'll be responding in that Google Doc or Google Slide if you're in Mrs. Gastineau's class. All right, so you may have noticed that your book club books are all fantasy. Well, that is because this unit is fantasy. We are so excited. We love to read fantasy as fifth grade teachers, and I'm hoping that you will also find that you enjoy fantasy as well. Something about fantasy that is amazing is it lets us explore different worlds, right? The stories are incredible. You're in a land with maybe dragons, with magic, things that don't happen in our everyday lives, but there's also really vivid descriptions of where the story is taking place, what the characters are looking like and who they are as a person, as well as those different magical things that might happen. So one reason that a lot of people love to read fantasy is because the stories are just incredible. Another reason is that it seems like maybe you're reading about some characters that don't exist in real life, whether it's vampires or wizards or hobbits like in Lord of the Rings. But really, when we start to analyze fantasy books, we find that it's really about the human condition. And what I mean by that is that in fantasy books, we often are looking at a struggle between good and evil, or we're looking at a struggle, an internal struggle between doing the right thing and maybe following the crowd. Those types of things that we really are faced with every day as people, but it's in a fantasy setting in these fantasy books that we'll be reading. Another reason that I'm excited for you to read fantasy and that we really encourage you to read fantasy is because overall it's going to help you become a better reader of different texts. It's just another genre, another type of book that is going to lead to you becoming a stronger reader. So with that said, let's go ahead and start thinking about something that's really important when you're reading fantasy. Knowing that books of the fantasy genre can take place anywhere, something that's really important to do as a reader is to consider the setting. So not only just where the story is taking place, but all of those different clues that help you figure out what kind of a place it is. What kinds of things are happening? What items are around the characters? How do the characters interact with those items and with where they are? So that is what we're going to be taking a look at today, is that we're going to figure out where your stories in your book clubs take place, but also what kind of places those are. All right, so now is the time to go ahead and open up to session 1 in your pink workbook. So you can see that I crossed this out. We won't be filling this in today, but that is what I just kind of talked over, the different reasons that we read fantasy. I quickly want us to look at the common fantasy settings box right here. Now this is not all of the fantasy settings, but some really common ones are a medieval world, so where there are knights and kings and queens and princesses and dragons. That's a type of setting that we often see when we're reading in fantasy. We also have some futuristic worlds where it might seem kind of similar to the world that we live in, but some things are happening that wouldn't happen here, whether it's because of technology or the way the government is run. You could think about Hunger Games as a good example of a futuristic world for this setting. Another really common fantasy setting is an ordinary world. So often these stories will start in a world similar to your own, and then some different magical or fantastical elements are added into the story. So a good example of this would be something like Harry Potter, where Harry starts out in London, just in his regular home, and then he's introduced to a magical world, or even the Chronicles of Narnia, where Lucy and Peter and Susan, they all start in just their regular home in a house that we would recognize or consider to be kind of current times, or at least back in history, and then they get introduced into a magical world, and that's where the fantasy really takes off. So those are 3 settings to keep in mind today: a medieval setting, futuristic setting, as well as an ordinary world setting. We're going to go ahead and analyze a couple of stories before you do this on your own in your book club book. So I'm thinking about The Thief of Always. What did you all think of chapters 3 and 4? I don't know about you, but I am so curious to see what else is going to happen in this book. But for right now, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to take a look at the cover as well as some blurbs to kind of get an idea of where might this story be taking place. Now, obviously, after listening to chapters 3 and 4, we got a whole bunch of information about the Holiday House, but I'm going to hold off on talking about that and instead take a look at the cover. On the cover, I can see kind of this, to me it looks spooky, maybe a castle looking home. I can see there's a blurb right here that says menacing demons, wondrous miracles, sinister magic, and vivid characters. A compulsive, lightning-paced tale that almost begs to be read aloud. For us, we're reading it out loud, right? From this blurb, I'm assuming there's some magic happening in this book, right? It's telling me that it's a fantasy book. It's not telling me much about where it's taking place, but the different items, the different things that are maybe going to be important to the setting and what kind of a place it is. If I read in the back, it says, Mr. Hood's holiday house has stood for 1,000 years, welcoming countless children into its embrace. It is a place of miracles where every childhood whim may be satisfied. There is a price to be paid, of course, but young Harvey Swick, bored with his life and beguiled by Mr. Hood's wonders, does not stop to consider the consequences. It is only when the house shows its darker face, when Harvey discovers the pitiful creatures that dwell in its shadows, that he comes to doubt Mr. Hood's philanthropy. So thinking about this blurb on the back as well as on the front, I am thinking that maybe Harvey is introduced into this fantasy world. Now, we've already read chapters 1 through 4, and thinking about those chapters, the book started off so quickly. I had to go back to chapter 1 and do a little bit of rereading because it seemed like Harvey was in this gray area, lots of fog. It was February. He was feeling kind of bored, feeling down. And then all of a sudden, Rick just showed up and he seems to have some magical characteristics himself, and he whisks Harvey away to Holiday House. So I'm realizing Harvey starts in his ordinary world. He's in his home, his mom's reminding him to do his chores, and then all of a sudden, he's whisked away. He's at this giant, kind of shimmering, moving wall with pebbles. I kind of pictured maybe some nice sunshine on those pebbles because they're shimmering, and it said that the weather was going from gray to sunny. And I'm realizing the kind of place that he's going to at Holiday House is a place where magical things can happen, right? We haven't really seen any of the darkness that this back blurb was talking about, but we're noticing in the house, when they describe the house in chapter 3, that it has a maze of hallways and doors that can lead to all sorts of adventures. There's a place where Harvey can build a treehouse outside. There's always good snacks and food. So I'm assuming that the Holiday House is the place where that fantasy magical element is being introduced. All right, readers, now it is your turn to go out and practice this. Right now, after hearing these instructions, I want you to pause this video, go back to your Google Doc from your teacher and click on the link to the book, The Paper Bag Princess. Have some of you read this before? It used to be one of my favorites when I was growing up. So what you'll do before you even start listening to the reading of Paper Bag Princess, just pause the video right at the start. There's a picture of the cover. Now this is a children's picture book, so it's going to be a little bit easier to analyze than The Thief of Always. But I want you to pause, look at the cover, and think about what elements do you see here? Is there a blurb on the cover that you can read for more information? And if not, what information about the setting, where the story takes place and what kind of place it is, are you getting just from the cover? When you've done that, play the video, listen to the reading of the story, and then you're going to come back to this page. And in this space, jot down some ideas that answer the question, where does the story take place and what kind of place it is? When you are done with that, come back to this video and we'll think about this together. All right, friends, if you are back at the video, that means that you have now watched or listened to, The Paper Bag Princess, as well as written in your journal a couple of ideas about where the story takes place and what kind of a place it is. Let's think through this together and see if your ideas match what I'm about to discuss. So when I first looked at the cover, I realized there wasn't a blurb giving me more information about the book. However, it is called The Paper Bag Princess, and I can see on the cover that there's a girl wearing a paper bag. She doesn't look like a typical princess that we'd see in stories, but I'm assuming that that's the princess. And then there's also a dragon and a giant like wooden looking door that I recognize maybe from like a dungeon or some type of castle. In my mind, seeing those clues about princess, dragon, and a setting picture that kind of reminds me of a castle, I'm thinking we're in the medieval times. Now, as the story goes on, or even kind of right on the first page, it says Elizabeth was a beautiful princess. She lived in a castle and had expensive princess clothes. She was going to marry a prince named Ronald. Medieval times? I think so. We can tell that there's a snotty looking prince on that first page. He has his nose in the air. There's a girl with like hearts flying around her who looks like that typical princess that we're used to. And from that description in the pictures, as well as that first couple sentences, I can tell that it's in it's in medieval times. And then it goes on though and says, unfortunately, a dragon smashed her castle, burned all her clothes with his fiery breath, and carried off Prince Ronald. First of all, hilarious. Second of all, I'm noticing now there's some magic, right? It's not just medieval times with knights and princesses. Now we have a magical element, the dragon coming in, smashing everything, and carrying poor Prince Ronald away. So now we have a magical element added to medieval times. I can think about what I know about historical fiction, knowing that this could be from like the Middle Ages, but with that dragon entering, now it's definitely a fantasy book and there's definitely a magical element. So do you see how I was able to look at the picture as well as the story in order to look at where is the setting and what kind of a place it is? So I'm thinking it's in the medieval world, possibly during the Middle Ages time period, but that now we have some magical elements getting introduced. And throughout the book, we can tell that there are more magical things that happen. All right, after all of this, I want you to turn to the next page in your journal. Now this, The Thief of Always, we did as a group and talked through it. So you are going to jump down to this page. What you should be doing is jot in the title of whichever book you're reading for your book club, and then think about this question and jot down some ideas. So it says, research about the setting. We just did this. If you're having trouble getting started with what to write here, think to yourself, what do I know about the setting? Where is the story taking place? What kind of descriptions describing that place have I had? You may need to do some rereading. Jot down a couple of ideas, and then you're going to go to your online Google Doc or to your Google Slide, your individual one, and respond to the questions that were posted in the assignment. Right, before I send you off to work, reminder that these are the things you're thinking about and what you'll be responding to in your Google Doc or Google Slide. So where does the story take place and what kind of a place is it? Now, if you're feeling kind of stuck, you can ask yourself some questions like these to help you think through where the story is taking place and what kind of a place is it. So how is the setting described? How are the characters dressed? That might give you some clues to the time period. Are there elements of magic? Pay attention to those. Just like in our book, The Thief of Always, all of a sudden you might start seeing elements of magic without them actually telling you what's going on. Pay attention for those clues. And then lastly, is there technology? Sometimes technology is a good clue for us as to where the story is taking place as well as what the time frame is, okay? If you are feeling stuck, again, take a step back, rewatch the video, maybe practice with Paper Bag Princess one more time. Ask an adult to sit with you and watch the video if you have a couple questions, and then you can always email your teacher with other questions. All right? Happy reading, team. We will see you tomorrow.